Perfect. Thank you. If you want to get started.
All right. Well, thank you. My name is Robert Spinelli, and I am the Archivist for Special Collections at Middle Tennessee State University.
And I'm Kaylee Alexander. I'm a research data librarian at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City.
Yes, so we're here today to talk to you all about a book project that we've been working on for the last few years, which is an edited collection being distributed by Bristol University Press. So for our collection, we came together through a different project, writing project, and decided that we wanted to put together a volume that would be comprised of chapters by librarians and archivists that would speak to some of the tasks of our work that isn't ordinarily talked about. And so, as we discussed ideas, we realized that we had a mutual interest in memorialization, in the ways in which grief and uh, uh, runs through grief and care, run through the work of librarianship. And so we wanted to open this up to a wider audience and explore some of the different ways in which these themes play into our work on a daily basis. And we specifically wanted to talk about this through the lens of death studies, which is a discipline that focuses on the ways in which grief and death work through different aspects of culture. And so this is where we came to this project. We can go to the next slide. So when we first began talking about this, one of the reasons that this project appealed to me was because I I was often thinking about the role of grief and memorialization in culture, especially related to mass shootings and other events that pop up continuously, and what happens to the materials that get created and donated during those times. We advance, please. So part of the one of the projects, archival projects that I've experienced in the past that really spoke to me was is a web documentary called "The Story of the Stuff" by a librarian named Ashley Maynor. And this project of hers documents the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in the early 2010s. And so in her project, she focused on the aftermath of the event and the mass amounts of materials that were sent as items of comfort and consolation to the community. So large quantities of letters, uh, items like teddy bears and paper cranes and candles, all sorts of things that were eventually sent to the community and amassed into quantities that were large enough to fill at least two warehouses. And what the what the community had to do in order to preserve some of these items afterwards, and how to manage all of the various things that commemorated this event. Ultimately, what happened to a large whatever the community could not preserve and store in their archival holdings was sent away and burned and turned into what they called sacred soil. And this was then used to help create the foundation for a permanent memorial on the site of the school shooting. So it was a way of turning all these physical manifestations of grief and sadness into something that would become more permanent and serve a purpose for the community after the event was had taken place. We can go to the next slide. So these are these images show two more examples of these kind of temporary memorials that sprang up in my local community in the last few years and had me begin to think about the question of uh, creating archives and collections related to temporary memorials to make some of these items themselves become more permanent so that they can be looked back upon, brought out if necessary, and just serve a greater purpose rather than being something that vanishes quickly in the aftermath of a mass casualty event. The Covenant School shooting happened in Nashville in 2023, in which 6 people were killed. And the Middle Tennessee State University event in 2024 refers to a suicide that happened actually in the um, library atrium shortly before I began working there. And so far, I have not personally been able to discover what happened to any of the items from these memorials, but it is something I'm still trying to pursue and figure out how they can be accessed if any of those things have been saved. We can go on, please. Okay, so what is the what would be the purpose of trying to archive and preserve items related to these kinds of tragic events? Of course, for many people, they might choose to keep these memorials as being temporary things that can be moved on from with relative ease and don't serve as reminders of the events after the fact. However, we working in this industry know that it is an essential part of our work to preserve the humanity of the people that we work with, our donors, the subjects of the different collections that we work with on a daily basis. And especially when we think about the idea of an archive that is documenting a mass casualty event, either on a smaller scale, like a community thing, or a larger national event like uh, September 11th, it requires a certain touch that uh, of care and concern that might be a little bit deeper than what you would normally consider in documenting and working with collections. You can go to the next slide, please. So for, I think, many of the chapters in our book speak to the idea that what we see at the surface level of a finding aid or a collection description is really just kind of the tip of the iceberg. So keeping in mind the quote that's on the screen right now, I'm not going to read it aloud, is that behind everything that we see in our collections is a whole series of deeper stories that that give a certain amount of life to the archive and helps to keep the stories that contain within breathing. And it's our job to give these stories room to stay alive and be discovered through anyone who comes to research and use these pieces in their own work. Okay, continue.
So, one of the things that we were really thinking about when coming to this project is what is happening in libraries. And, we're both based in the US, so thinking specifically about the United States. Um, and one of the big things that's happening here is big moves in terms of book banning. So, when Robert approached me about doing this project, perhaps, when we started talking about things, I realized that we were sort of experiencing a kind of grief of our own uh, in as librarians, and especially as librarians in these more conservative areas. So, at the University of Utah, we had a speaker, Emily Knox, who's a scholar of censorship and book banning. And she came and she talked about this switch that happened during COVID, especially in conservative areas of the United States, as children and young adults were taking their schooling into the home more. Parents had more oversight. They had a new level of access to what their kids were reading. And they often saw these kind of chunks of text out of context that they were deeming inappropriate or even in cases pornographic. And because of this, we have an increase in a minority of parents really pushing loudly for banning books. Um, Not surprisingly, a lot of these challenges happen for disproportionately against books that feature, for example, queer characters and queer narratives or people of color. When we looked at the data for Utah, where I'm based, for example, 41% of the challenged books featured LGBTQ plus characters, 35% featured multicultural themes or characters of color. And this was, a kind of grief in itself too. What is the loss of a library space? And we're talking mostly about books being challenged in school libraries, public libraries, but we're also, especially in places like Utah, starting to see this leach into academic library spaces as well, especially as we see more legislation coming down against DEI and what we can or cannot even, potentially research. And as a librarian now, I kind of even, wonder how sharing some of this work that I'm doing about this project will affect me going forward as different things change. Before I became a librarian, though, I was trained as a visual culture historian, and I worked a lot about monuments and memorials. And so I started thinking about, well, how does the library and the archive function as this kind of monument or a monument under attack specifically? And I started thinking about monument removals too. In the early stages of the pandemic in the US, we saw a large shift in contests against Confederate monuments, especially people wanting to rename memorials and even buildings that were named for Confederate leaders, and then the actual physical removal of many of these monuments as well. And we see a kind of spike in this activity in the early 2020s. As we've experienced regime change, if you will, in the US, we've seen this kind of activity peter out, but book banning has gone on the rise. And this is not to say that, one is causing the other or vice versa, but there is this kind of reactionism here that can't be ignored. As one group feels that their history is being erased, quite literally from the landscape, we see other narratives begin to be attacked or removed from public spaces. Bringing this a little bit further, I started thinking, okay, well, what about these sites of memories has to do with libraries as well? And I was thinking a lot about this concept of the lieu de mémoire or the site of memory. Oops, go back. And this is something that Pierre Noroy, a French historian, describes as something being inherently contradictory. They're these simple, but also kind of vague, natural and artificial objects, sites, spaces, texts that function or that emerge from like a will to remember. Um, these sites exist, he says, because the milieu or the real environments of memory have kind of disappeared. The living memory of things no longer exists, and we have these just kind of fragments here that are mediated interpretations and kind of become the stuff of history. Um, but not just preserving memory, these become kind of symbolic sites that conjure abstract notions of community, identity, culture. And then in this respect, libraries and archives kind of concurrently function as these milieu, these real sites where things happen, memories are created and experienced, but then also where those traces are preserved after the living memory kind of dies or passes. So taking this further too, I was thinking a lot about memory studies. So Maurice Avlox, Lida Asman, Jan Asman, and also thinking about these distinctions between communicative and cultural memory. These have been called different things by different scholars, but in the interest of brevity, I'm just going to use these two terms, communicative and cultural. The communicative is the historical experiences kind of informal experiences between people that happen on an everyday experience. They last more or less a generation, 80 to 100 years. And then the cultural memory is when these communicative memories become kind of cemented in history, and they're based on fragments, and they become things like rites, ceremonies, festivals. They can also be things like history books and memorials and whatnot as well. So whereas communicative memory is organic, cultural memory kind of emerges when these lived experiences become codified or become institutionalized. And again, thinking about the library as some space that doesn't just preserve cultural memory, but also engages dynamically in creating communicative memory and then producing the cultural memory through these kind of cycles of transmission and preservation. Libraries, I think in particular, constitute these kind of communicative memory sites. They function as community centers. They can foster social connections. We host lectures, we have exhibitions, cultural gatherings, and so on and so forth. But then we also are repositories for items. So they're both these spaces of living memory and cultural memory. Um, Taking it like another step further, we have stored versus functional memory. Stored memory are those things that are unusable, obsolete, foreign, these kind of neutral objects, factual knowledge, but also they've been called the repertoire of missed opportunities, unused chances. Whereas functional memory is an acquired memory. So that's the option, they emerge from processes of choosing and connecting and constituting meaning, taking these disconnected fragments of stuff, of memories, and kind of creating meaning from them. So you can think of the functional memory as kind of a history in the making. So within this classification system, you can start to see archives as emerging as primarily spaces of, sorry, got to pop up here, of stored memory, and libraries as functional memory spaces. Although the processes of selection, organization, public access to things, libraries don't merely store culture, they also create and promote it. Archives, on the other hand, as stored memory spaces, curate materials that are somehow deemed worthy of preserving because they've passed through some selection process or because they're seen as potentially the thing of history making. So this is really what Robert's thinking about in terms of these temporary memorials. What can and cannot be preserved? What does get into the archive versus what gets turned into, a soil that's going to lay the groundwork for a memorial, and then what ultimately just gets thrown out because it's not seen as important either. So I also started thinking about libraries and archives as counter monument spaces. So this is a term that's coined by Holocaust scholar James Young in 1992. It describes monuments and memorials that kind of deviate from normative commemorative practices. So not these grand bronze and marble statues to so-called great men and war heroes, but things that really make you reflect and contemplate meaning, right? And Erica Doss also kind of talks about the anti-monument as something that emerges in the 20th and 21st century US. These are more democratic, temporary memorials. They're not per se monuments. And so thinking about the library in this way too, we wanted to create a volume that kind of filled this gap of thinking about libraries as just repositories, as kind of memory holders, but also as memorials themselves, as memorials that allow people to engage in individual or collective group processing, documentation, and preservation as well. Some other recent work that's been done is by Andrew Schenken in looking at the everyday life of memorials. So he calls attention to the fact that memorials, whether they're these kind of temporary structures or bronze massive statues, they become activated at certain times through human interaction. Otherwise, they're just kind of the passive furniture of everyday urban life. We have to interact with them for the memorials to work. And the library and the archive also functions in this way as a really important place where they can be activated through collective grief and trauma. So keeping all of this kind of framework in mind, we started thinking about how we were going to split up the volume, and I'll pass it back to Robert to talk a little bit about the organization of the book itself.
Thank you. Yes. So we decided to organize this volume into three distinct sections that would all speak to various aspects of the roles of grief, absence, and then memorialization and activation/creation. Our first section here is about loss. You can see the titles of the various chapters, but it covers various different topics, including digitization, touching on the idea of digitization processes, what gets left out, what gets kept, and how these choices are made. The idea of extinction and libraries and archives documenting the extinctions of species, and as well as dealing with climate change issues that will affect everybody in time. And then we move into discussions about more specific communities and grief as found in the marginalia of literature as well. So we tried to really pick a broad range of subjects that would be able to speak to some of the aspects that we have to deal with in our work all the time. Okay, we can advance to the next slide. Yes. So when we come to the topic of grief, again, there were many pathways to go down, and we selected a number that would also speak to different aspects of grief, different layers of grief, and grief in community and personal spaces as well. So we have Chapter 5, which documents the community archives for the Girls Rock Columbia Community Archive. And this one touches on the idea of, again, archival silences, which permeates a theme that permeates the book in general. Whose stories get left out of the official documentation, why this happens, and how archives and libraries can work towards resolving some of the issues thrown up when we are omitting certain details and stories from the historical record. Chapter 6 returns to the topic of kind of natural disaster and grief, and analyzes the ways in which storms destroyed a large number of old and very large trees on a college campus, and how this changed the shape of the university setting, and how the college community reacted to the grief resulting from this. Sorry, my computer is having issues. Kaylee, would you actually mind taking over here? I have to get my charger and plug my computer in.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so thinking about how they kind of archived and created a grief centered space on campus for an ecological loss. We've also had essays dealing with grief processing over COVID, and then also ways of navigating grief in the archives. So Frances Cullen, for example, talks about one specific painting that she had in her family and how she worked through the loss of personal loss through that as well. And then in our third section, we move kind of progressively to the act of commemoration, where we're looking at more case studies about different types of records that were kept in archives and how they respond to different events of loss. So archiving, for example, lesbian cultural memory and thinking about reconstituting loss in the archive, creating a digital memorial for Remember Me, which was a COVID commemoration project, and then some more, which I won't go into because we're getting short on time. But you can see the volume moves progressively from that initial loss to the act of grieving, and then ultimately to the act of memory making and commemorating in the archive. And then I just want to end with something that we were thinking about in the coda as we were trying to bring all of this together. We have this really interesting thing in the library at the University of Utah, which is the automatic retrieval system, or ARC. And it was meant to be, an off-site storage system that was on-site. And it houses millions of objects. We've got 20,000 storage bins that contain about 1 million+ items. And they're kind of just like plucked into the belly of the library here. And they're items that we don't use very often, but they're retrievable very quickly upon request. So it keeps these materials nearby, but ultimately renders them kind of indivisible. And this was established in 2008, and it was the largest system of its kind in North America. And then only 20 years later, more or less, we've run out of space again. We've reached capacity. So we're trying to actually get a second one of these robots in place as well. And part of this is too, we've lost a special collection storage building. We had to relocate 60,000 linear feet of archival material because this building's going to be demolished and they're going to do something for the baseball team or something like that. I don't know. But ultimately, it was deemed not purposeful to the university in some way. So we have to find out how we're going to deal with all of these special collection materials. And in my previous life as a historian of cemeteries and monuments, I couldn't help but see this kind of weird parallel between what's happening in 19th century French cemeteries and what's happening in the library today. I won't go into all of it. You can find my other book online if you're really interested in all of that. Um, but ultimately, it's about keeping dead things close so that they're accessible, but also keeping them out of sight and out of mind to be able to respond to administrative pressures, to keep things close enough to be access ready, but also removed enough to address escalating spatial concerns. And when this physical kind of becomes a limitation, we often turn to the digital. We think the digital is this endless archival space and like the idea of the ethereal cloud, right, where all objects can be encountered face to face, and they kind of become these ghosts of what they once were. But of course, there's a lot of material loss that happens there as well. It's sort of second death of the objects. And we started thinking about all of this at the end of the book, which of course made us think, well, there's a lot more that we can be doing here with this topic. And we've had a lot of really great response to the just promoting of the book and so forth. So we're really hoping that this collection is going to be a bit of food for thought and allow people to start thinking more about the interactions between death and grief in spaces like libraries and archives, not as just repositories, but actually as memory makers and memory keepers. So with that, I'm going to offer everyone a little discount code, which is good until December if you're interested in ordering the book. It's available via that QR code. But otherwise, if you have any questions about the volume, we're eager to hear what you have to say. You can also contact us over email if that's easier.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I did share the link to both this book and also your other book in the chats. And we do have a question for you. So someone's asking, I wonder where loss comes in for digital memories. These could be more social media posts or websites, etc. How do we and do we preserve these things that may be sometimes created as ephemeral? How do we mourn, for example, what Twitter was on MySpace, etc.?
So I'll start to speak to that one too. So that's a very good question, and there's actually in a fair amount of work on the topic of digital afterlives and what happens to websites and web technologies as they become obsolete and where all that data and information goes. And this is actually a subject that we are actively discussing and thinking about kind of uh, spinning off of on another project in the near future. So, Kaylee, if you have anything else you want to add there, I think it is a great
Yeah.
one right for picking.
There's a lot that can be said there, and I think my mind immediately jumps to like Internet Archive, and thinking about that as kind of like a cemetery for dead websites. But I don't know what we do with things like Morning Twitter or MySpace and how they were once, you know, functional, pre X or something. I think it's a really compelling question and something we can probably talk a lot about. But yeah, Robert and I have been thinking about these kind of digital deaths or AI death and whatnot as well. So if you want to continue this conversation, I'm sure we'd both love to hear from you after the conference as well.
Great, thank you. The thing that I was thinking about throughout your presentation, and particularly when you Robert, were mentioning the mass casualty events, is how library and archive staff can deal with, because it would feel to me like it would perhaps be quite a large kind of, I don't know that burden is the correct word, but quite a large thing to kind of deal with if you are consistently dealing with kind of grief events and kind of memorial items. And I was wondering if what you kind of thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those situations where, you know, you might even need to have like a separate team who would be able to come in to work on these things, especially if like the casualty event happened on the campus or in the library, is the case with my institution, because it might be way too close for people to want to have to work with these materials on their that happened where they work every day and have to, have their second lives occurring. But that is a really interesting part to think about. I can't think of scholarship that speaks directly to that either. So it might be another kind of untouched or very aspect that has little attention paid to it.
Great, thank you so much. We are at the end of the session now, so please all join me in thanking Kaylee and Robert. It's been a really interesting session. And again, thank you to Tiffany and Hazel as well. Please do join us again for the next and final set of sessions for today in another 15 minutes. That is at 5:30 p.m. UK time. Your time zone will vary. But yeah, thank you again, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.